My name is Colin Rose. I am the Assistant Superintendent of Opportunity and Achievement Gaps in Boston Public Schools. And I'm here to moderate a panel of really 4 great presentations that you'll get to see. My job in the district really includes looking at opportunities for our most marginalized communities and youth. And I think these 4 panelists have a unique story to tell in their own way around what the nature of opportunity and opportunity gaps are. The words opportunity and achievement gaps is in the title of my office, but it is our opinion, as we believe in the ability of all of our populations, that really achievement gaps are just the manifestations of opportunity gaps. And I think these 4 presentations will get at the core of some of those issues, and hopefully we can have a nice lively discussion afterwards. Without further ado, I'm going to kind of announce who's going to be presenting, what they'll be presenting on, and then we'll have them come up and do their thing, all right? And I'll get off the stage. First, we're going to have Joseph McLaughlin from the Boston Private Industry Council, and he will be presenting on their presentation around 6-year college completion outcomes, looking at the Boston Public Schools class of 2011. After that, Stephanie Marek, sorry, she's a colleague of mine at BPS. We'll be looking at expanded learning time and that growth in BPS and what that has done for us as we've moved all of our K-8s to extended learning time. After that, Nancy Hill will be presenting on something that's dear to my heart because we work together on it. It'll be the Opportunity Index, looking at place-based measures and adding that into how we look at need for students in the Boston Public Schools and what we can possibly do with that. And then finally, we have Mariah Contreras, who's going to be looking at the ethnic congruence among our students, their neighborhoods, and their schools, and what happens when there's mismatch. So without further ado, Joseph, why don't you come up? And thank you for being here.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Colin. As Colin mentioned, I'm here to present a study that I co-authored with my colleague Annika Van Neen, who's here as well, on the 6-year college completion rates of class of 2011. Title report's called Staying the Course, and it's available on the Boston Foundation's website. We released it just 2 weeks ago at the Boston Foundation. And prepared for Success Boston, the Success Boston Initiative. Before I start out with the main kind of findings of the study, I thought it would be good just to kind of frame, since the topic of this session is education as a tool for mobility, just what we think about in terms of higher education. Higher education is widely viewed as a driver of economic and social mobility. When you look at earnings data of Massachusetts adults by level of educational attainment, these are adults that work full-time, you'll see that earnings rise considerably with education. Bachelor's degrees in our state, median earnings are $60,000, about $25,000 more than those with a high school degree. So it's clear, on average, if you get more education, you earn more, which is important for climbing the economic ladder. But what we also know from research done on the Economic Mobility Project, this one goes back about 9-10 years ago. Everybody knows more recently that Raj Chetty's work, but even prior to that, we had a Pew-funded mobility project that had some really interesting findings that basically confirmed that college education strongly affects whether Americans can climb the economic ladder. When we look at that third bullet point, one of the things that we want to, you want to understand is how can people move up from the bottom rung, and can they do better than their parents when you think of mobility? And what what the research has found is that adult children from poor and low-income families who earn a college degree are much more likely to move up than their peers who do not earn a college degree. And in fact, attaining a degree quadruples the likelihood that you'll go from the bottom quintile to the top based on that study's findings. However, what's important to note is that we have not achieved equality of opportunity in degree attainment. And recently, from Educational Longitudinal Survey findings, the ELS, we looked at 10th graders back in 2002 and tracked them nationally until their mid-20s, and found that only 41% of those that were academically strong but from low socioeconomic status backgrounds graduated from college, compared to those that 74% of those similarly scoring students in 10th grade but from high socioeconomic backgrounds. So the difference is like 33 points. That's not really a gap. That's like a chasm. When you think about it, those 10th graders from the low-income families, overperform. They match their high income peers in high school. But then when they go to college, they're much less likely to complete. So this is why tracking college completion is so important. We need to understand who's enrolling in college and who's completing, understand the gaps, and disaggregate them, and then find ways to promote and boost college completion overall so we can boost mobility. So this study, class of 2011, again, we tracked them for 6 years. So they graduated in 2010, 2011 from Boston Public Schools. We tracked them through the summer of 2017. I'll go over this quickly, but the way we're able to do this is we work with the school district to get graduate records from the district with background characteristics like gender and race. We merge it with the National Student Clearinghouse database, which is a national administrative database, so we could track high school graduates anywhere in the country. We cover about 96 to 97% of all the college enrollments. And we get that on their semesters of enrollment, other things that we can do so we could kind of disaggregate the findings. So here's now to kind of jump into the main thing. So the first thing is before you complete college, you have to enroll. And we track first-year enrollments for BPS classes. This slide begins with class of 2005. And when I say first year, what we're doing is we're just looking at the enrollment rates of the high school classes within the first year after high school. So do they enroll in the immediate fall semester or the spring following in college? And you'll see that we've gone from 61% to 70.5% for the most recent year we studied, class of 2011. So it's about a 10-point increase over time. To put a number on that, there's about 3,401 graduates in the class of 2011. So a 10-point increase is about 340 more students enrolling in college. Now, across gender and race, you'll see that females are more likely to enroll than males, 75% versus 65%. And then across race, the difference is the purple bars are the first-year enrollees. Asians are at the high end, 84% compared to 65% for Latino students, 68% for black. So there's a race ethnic gap of about 20 points from top to bottom. Those gray shaded bars are those that enroll anytime after the first year in high school. So one of the advantages of the data is we could track you 6 years after high school. And you'll see that on the bars for the race ethnic groups, the race ethnic gaps narrow a little bit over time. As more students, black and Latino students, will attempt to enroll in college. And overall, the differences in college enrollment have shrunk over time that we've done this work as well. Now that takes us to completion. So who completes? So in the aggregate, we've been able to track this now for 10 years with the Clearinghouse. And the original study, we found that about 41% of the first-year enrollees completed college within 6 years. We're now up to 52% for class of 2011, which is the highest to date. And when you factor in the increases in enrollment, that means a lot more students are completing college overall. However, there's a lot of variation among that 52%. So when we look at it across gender and race ethnic groups, males graduate at about 44% rate versus 57% of the females that enrolled within the first year after high school. And then across race ethnicity, black and Latino students had a completion rate of about 43% compared to white and Asian students at 66 and 74%. So the race ethnic gap here on completion is almost like 33 points. It's a lot wider than what I just showed on enrollment. Now, we're also able to look at how students fare based on where they go to college. So what I did was I break out on the next slide the type of college that students attend, and we break into basically 3 sectors: 2-year public, 4-year private, and 4-year public. Now, the important thing to remember is that at the college level, colleges select their students, right? So the 4-year private schools have selective admissions. They take students with generally higher test scores, higher academic backgrounds. So you would expect them to have higher completion rates. Our 2-year schools tend to be more open enrollment. So they're accepting students generally lower test scores on average. But here's what we know. So when we look at the completion rates, they range pretty considerably from 2-year to 4-year. But at the 2-year level, we track what percentage of students complete within 6 years, and it's 24%. For 4-year public, it's 64%, and for 4-year private, it's a little bit higher at 67%. Now, the shades of purple, the darker purple on the bottom, those are students that completed at their starting institution, which most do. But we could also track if you complete at a different 2-year or a different 4-year institution over time. Now, those are the students that complete, so we still know some students are working towards a degree. So even at the 6-year mark, 13% of those that started at a 2-year school are still enrolled somewhere pursuing a degree, their first degree, and it's about 9% at 4-year public and 4-year private. Now, this last one, this blue area, these are students that are, across the country known as sort of the sum college. So these are students that, completed some years of college, but they they have not finished a degree. Among the two-year group, we have 63% versus 27 to 24% that attempted at four-year schools but are no longer enrolled working towards a degree. Now, one of the things we did on this new report was we wanted to understand a little bit more about the two-year enrollment patterns of students. So we know most students that enroll in two-year schools do not go full-time for 4 straight years or for 2 straight years and earn a degree. And so what we wanted to look at was how do students enroll over their first 4 semesters that they would be able to go, so over the first 2 years. And we broke out the cohort, so we had 618 students that we tracked that enrolled in that immediate fall. And you'll see that 53% of them took at least 1 semester off within the first 4 semesters, the first 2 years they started. Only 9% went full-time continuous. Only 9% of the 618 went full-time, fall, spring, the first year after high school, and did the same thing the second year. And then about a third mixed full-time and part-time, but stayed enrolled all 4 semesters. And then the last group was just part-time continuous. So they stayed enrolled, but only went part-time. Now the reason why we show this is that their completion rates of these groups differ considerably. So this is the last slide. 70% of the students that went full-time continuous, now it was only 56 students in total, but 70% completed, which is actually above the completion rates we had for the four-year students. When you look at full-time, part-time, 39%. And then if you look at that last bar, those that took a semester off, it's only 8%. So even if you look at the full-time and part-time continuous group, they're like 4 to 5 times more likely to complete within 6 years than those that took 1 semester off. So now we know that community college students are mixing school, they're mixing work, they have other financial obligations. But it's the factors that affect whether they can go full-time or part-time clearly are contributing to whether they can complete or not. And I'll end there. We have a quick summary here, and again, the full report is available, and I look forward to any questions. Thank you.
We'll bring up Stephanie Marek.
Hi, everyone. I'll say good afternoon because we're education people. We get up early, and people have had lunch by now in most schools. I'm currently at central office for the district. I mostly manage longer day and after-school grants. We use the Opportunity Index in doing that, so excited about that. And I want to talk about a research practitioner partnership that we had with the American Institutes of Research around expanded learning time. I want to talk a little bit about the context of ELT in the district because it's complicated, and then get more into the research itself. So this research came about because over a decade, the district has utilized many different initiatives to expand its school day. Massachusetts currently has one of the shortest school days in the country. The national average is about 7 hours a day. Whereas in Massachusetts, our school day is about 6 hours to 6 hours, 20 minutes, depending on whether you're elementary, middle, or high school. So for several years, Boston Public Schools has been utilizing various initiatives, whether it's Turnaround, Innovation Pilot, or more recently, the Mayoral Schedule A initiative, which, like Colin said, has dramatically increased the school day in about half of our schools. So we are trying to go beyond the 6 hours and make that the new traditional day in Boston. So at the time of this research, we really wanted to know, because we have so many schools who are increasing the length of their day, who are these schools? How are they using their time? What are the strengths and challenges of implementation? And most importantly, is this time helping to close opportunity and achievement gaps? We also wanted to look at what are these schools doing well, and how can we use that to inform best practices? So here's a timeline showing how Schedule A ELT came into play in alignment with this research. So we put in the application for this research about 6 months before this new initiative was signed. So they were in alignment. The first year of the research was in 2015-16. which is when the first wave of this new ELT was happening. So we were interviewing schools as they were implementing this new ELT, and then they had a second wave of and third wave of Schedule A implementation as we were continuing with the project. So first things first, we had to define what ELT was, which really hadn't been done in our context before. So we looked at what was currently happening and saw that most longer day schools were adding an average of 30 minutes a day. So that became our threshold. And again, this is an average. So schools that have a shortened Wednesday or a shortened Friday aren't excluded. So we're looking at about an additional 150 minutes per week. And again, we're basing that on top of the Massachusetts traditional day. So when we looked at this in 2015-16, we had 46 out of about 120 schools that had a longer day. And you can see the breakdown by school type. And again, these different types reflect a lot of different initiatives that have been rolled out over the past 10 plus years. So we see that about half are traditional schools, which include the Schedule A, as well as turnaround, in-district charter, innovation, and pilot. And if we take these school types and we look at the amount of time that's added, there are definitely trends here. So looking at extra 30 minutes on the right, we see innovation and turnaround. Not surprising, turnaround schools are required to add 30 minutes. Going up, pilot and traditional add about 40, which is very typical. And then in-district charters add about double than this. So by far adding the most time in Boston Public Schools. So in year one, we wanted to focus on more qualitative data and just get a picture of ELT in the district. We have a student information system that has a lot of data in it, but it really can't tell us dosage in terms of minutes of ELA or enrichment or intervention or things like that. So we contacted schools, we interviewed 40 of the 46, we interviewed staff, and school leaders to ask them about how they've used time, how did their implementation work, what are their strengths and challenges of ELT. And mainly what we found is that school staff really saw a difference with students having the extra time and more learning opportunities, as well as relationship building with the students. However, there's a lot of concern about teacher burnout, which we're still very interested in monitoring. Other challenges included having quality community partnerships, as well as fully integrating the time. If you're adding 40 minutes, really restructuring your day rather than just plunking 40-minute block at the end. And we also collected autonomous school plans and really anything we could find to get a full picture. We also asked schools how they would define successful ELT. And we got 4 main answers, one being increased student academic achievement, teacher satisfaction, family satisfaction, and increased social emotional growth. And we use this to frame year 2, which was the quantitative work. We looked at data, thank you. We looked at data across all of these questions, and we really wanted to be representative. Ultimately, given the time that we had, we did the most robust analysis around academic achievement, which is what I'll talk about next. But we did at least do preliminary analysis using teacher, student, parent climate surveys, looking at attendance. We really tried to get a wide range. But given that we're looking from 2005 to present, PARC and MCAS was our most complete data set with which to do a really robust analysis. So, and given that I'm the practitioner, it'll be tricky for me to answer like the nitty-gritty methodological questions around this, but AIR developed a comparative interrupted time series analysis. So essentially what they did was take all the ELT schools, break them up by cohort, so schools that implemented in 2005 were in a different cohort than schools that implemented in 2010 to honor those different contexts. Then they created a matched group of non-ELT schools that had similar student demographics, similar grades, similar academic achievement, and then did a comparison between the two. So essentially what that did was ask and give some information. If this school did not have a longer day, what would we expect their achievement to look like. And we were very, very excited about the results. So we are looking at CPI scores here. So this is out of a 100-point scale, and I'll explain what all of this means. So we found positive impact overall, which is the chart in the middle, but also for a lot of subgroups, which really gets at the heart of closing opportunity and achievement gaps. So the blue bars represent the growth that you'd see on a 100-point scale after 1 year of a longer day. So we see, for example, for Black students in math, we saw on average 3.9 points higher out of 100. After 2 years of ELT, 7.7 points higher in math MCAS scores, which, given that we're talking on a 100-point scale, is sizable. We also saw impacts for Hispanic students in both math and ELA. We saw impact for English language learners in math, kind of surprisingly, and math and ELA for economically disadvantaged students. So we were very, very happy to see these impacts. Any statistically significant impact we saw was positive. So that was fantastic. So given what we've seen, and I'll leave this up here a minute longer, we want to keep digging into this because now we kind of see that ELT is having impact, but we don't have a lot of best practices and how schools are using this time to best realize these gains. And that's what we'd love to do more in the future. So for future research questions, we want to add the more current data that we have, bring it up to date, see how perceptions around strengths and challenges have changed, focus on the schools that have had the highest growth, and really try to get into best practices. So we want to keep this going. I want to thank everyone involved from BPS, AIR, University of Chicago, as well as our advisory panels. Joe McLaughlin sat on one of our advisory panels, so thanks to everyone. If you want to see the full reports as well as the executive summary that has all of the impact information, this link will take you to the research. It's also on the Boston Public Schools website. If you Google BPS ELT research, you can find it too. Thank you very much.
Now I'll bring up Nancy Hill, talk about the Opportunity Index.
Thanks, Colin. My name is Nancy Hill. I'm a developmental psychologist by training on faculty at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard University. You see my co-authors here, which include Colin, because this is a collaboration between the Boston Area Research Initiative and Boston Public Schools, and Dan and Mariah, who we'll hear from in just a moment. I also want to acknowledge Guido, who's in the audience here. He helped with a lot of these analyses around the Opportunity Index. Now, we heard about an Opportunity Index this morning, and that index is really important in terms of understanding neighborhoods. But what this index is doing is aggregating it up to the school level so that we can understand the opportunities that and issues that arise from students as they aggregate into schools. So the problem, as we see it, is that school assignments are no longer done at the neighborhood level. So when you go into schools, schools are, and their assignments and enrollments are decoupled from the neighborhood of residence in which students live, such that school leaders, school building leaders, may be unaware of the needs of their student body because they're coming from different neighborhoods, and they can't necessarily count on the resources in the community surrounding the school to be accessible to the students that are in their building. And so the students who are in their building are coming from diverse neighborhoods which have diverse needs, opportunities, and risks associated with them. And so at the building level, it's often unclear how building leaders will understand the needs of their students and can't count on necessarily agencies or communities in the neighborhood around the school to be available to the students that they serve. So what districts need is an easy, adaptable, flexible indicator of students' needs at the school level, which they can use to inform programming, funding, and things like that. And so with that, the Boston Area Research Initiative and the Boston Public Schools, including Colin's office and also the Finance Department and the Partnership Office, we all collaborated to develop this Opportunity Index, which is a place-based opportunity index that accounts for inequalities that arise from factors outside of the control of the schools. And also, so both place-based neighborhood kinds of characteristics and also other kinds of inequalities that arise from outside of the school, that are outside of the school's control. There are lots of things within the school's control and equities and inequities within the school building, but we're trying to account for things that we essentially kids bring to school in their backpacks. So a schematic of the theoretical and policy model looks like this, and I'm hoping I have a pointer here. I do, fantastic. So you have academic outcomes, and then you have variations between schools in need. And some of these variations come from individual indicators or disparities at home, and other kinds of variations in school come from disparities in neighborhood resources. So neighborhood level resources, risk, neighborhood levels of SES, and residential segregation, which we see a lot of in Boston, we heard a lot more about this morning, often lead to neighborhood disparities in resources, which lead to kids coming to school with different risks and opportunities. And so the opportunity index that we are creating is essentially to account for or give a numerical value for these kinds of disparities from the neighborhood and home that might result in disparities at school. It's grounded in prior theory and research based on social and cultural isolation theories, such that children who come from low-resource neighborhoods are often isolated from the kinds of resources, the kinds of social capital and influential adults that might help model upward mobility. It also is based in social disorganization theories of neighborhoods, so high levels of instability in the neighborhood, high levels of crime actually undermined communities' ability to develop collective efficacy and shared community goals, where neighbors know each other, neighbors look after each other's children. When you live in neighborhoods that are highly disorganized, a lot of those kind of community factors that help children along the way of their development are often isolated. So bottom line first, in case something happens before my 10 minutes is up and I can't get to the analyses, here's the take-home message right at the front. Neighborhoods matter, but we knew that already. And what we found is that based on variations of neighborhoods and the things that we were able to measure, that neighborhoods differ by as much as 20 points on MCAS scores. So where kids are living, once you kind of account for other aspects of schooling, other aspects of individual characteristics, where you live can drive as much of a 20-point difference on MCAS scores. And this is largely driven by differences in neighborhood on public safety, socioeconomic status, and the academic attainment of adults in their neighborhood. This is not their parents' academic attainment, but the academic attainment of other adults in their neighborhood. And individual characteristics still matter, so when you look at the other part of this, the individual characteristics, ELL, special education, free and reduced price lunch, poverty also still matter, even when you account for individual differences. So what we looked at in terms of indicators, we looked at educational attainment, which is % of adults with bachelor's degrees in the neighborhood. This is not parents' education level, but other adults. We looked at public safety, including private conflict, public violence, gun use, which we were able to get from public records, public health, including major medical emergencies or 911 calls with major medical emergencies in the community. Also, youth health emergencies, socioeconomic status, which we got from the census data, including median income, % employment, poverty rate, public assistance, and newcomers, so % foreign born in the neighborhood. We also looked at residential stability, including median years in the neighborhood and home ownership to get at that sense of stability, and also physical disorder, private neglect, public disintegration, and these sorts of things, denigration. Custodianship and 311 use, so the extent to which people will call in and report that street light is out or a pothole or these sorts of things, or how people care about their neighborhoods. So with those, in the model, we developed this model that would use these to create a score for each school. We found that public health, newcomer status, and residential stability were not significant predictors, but the others were. And this is what it looked like. The orange bar is high school, the red bar is middle school, the blue bar is elementary school on all of these. And we see here that academic attainment of adults in the neighborhood account for increases in MCAS scores, most importantly at high school. Public safety also matters. SES also matters, with slight differences across increases in the importance of public safety, decreases in relatively flat differences across elementary, middle, and high school in terms of SES of the neighborhood. Interestingly, custodianship, or the extent to which people will call 911, matters positively only for elementary school. And physical disorder matters only for elementary school kids, and it's negatively related. So we know that education or neighborhoods matter. There are clearly also individual characteristics outside of the neighborhood, and we compared those across neighborhood factors. So individual characteristics, we looked at free and reduced price lunch or poverty. We also looked at special services, special education, ELL, prior school experiences, so attendance, suspensions, and these sorts of things, to see if that would erase the impact of neighborhood. They are significant, but they don't erase the impact of neighborhood. And what we see is this is former ELL status. So if you've been in an ELL program but have come out of it and are in mainstream classrooms, it's a positive impact. Having prior ELL experience is positively associated with MCAS scores, especially at elementary school. Current ELL status is particularly disadvantage for high school students. This one here is free and reduced price lunch, which matters more at elementary school than in high school. And this one here is special education status, which is is problematic across the board, but more so for high school. So in conclusion, but you already know the conclusions because you heard that first. Place matters, so the neighborhood kind of level or neighborhood opportunity index can account for up to 20 points in MCAS. The individual characteristics matter even more on top of that. And for older students, we can predict future performance based on risk factors or the individual level characteristics, and that the opportunity index can be effectively used to account for a substantial amount of variation outside of the control of schools. And what the Finance and Partnership and Colin's Office with Opportunity and Achievement Gaps is, we can give a score for each school on a neighborhood, on their opportunity index, and use that to direct funding so that schools who have kids who come from more disadvantaged neighborhoods can actually get more resources to serve those students so they're ready to learn when they come to school and sit into the classroom. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nancy. Mariah?
Hello, everyone. So first, I'm going to ask for a little audience participation. I want you all to think back to your schooling years, elementary, middle, or high school, whatever you'd like, and think about, if you were to fill out the census, as we do, what category you would check, what box you would check on that form, and then think about who in your neighborhood that you grew up in also was represented by that same box. And so if I could poll the audience, who in this audience falls within the 0 to 25% range of people in your neighborhood that would be similar to you racially and ethnically? Okay. Who would fall in somewhere between 25 and 50% of people in your neighborhood that would look like you? Okay. And who would fall in the 50 to 75% group? Okay, a few more. And who among us would fall in the 75 or greater? Okay. And so likewise, I want you to think about the school that you went to during the time period that you're thinking of. And so when you think about the student body, we'll reserve teachers for later, but when you think about the student body that you attended school with, who falls in the 0 to 25% like ethnic peer group here? Okay. And who would fall in the 25 to 50%? Okay. And who would fall in the 50 to 75%? Okay. And who would be in the well-represented 75% or greater, like peers? Okay. So I'm going to present on similar ideas about ethnic representation of students in BPS. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the partners that we have worked with through multiple data sets used in this analysis. So we have Boston Public School. I've seen a few of you here. Colin, James, Nicole Wagner, and Barry Kaufman, who have helped think through how the processes informing the data go, what the data represent, and importantly, who the students are in the data. And then my co-authors, Nancy Hill and Dan O'Brien, and my dear collaborator, Guido, who can raise his hand again. Okay, and so in light of time, I want to make sure that we have firm definitions of what we're talking about here. And so in the literature, ethnic congruence represents the extent to which an individual is similar to the aggregate of people residing within his or her neighborhood or school, important proximal contexts. And I like to talk about this as your representation. Okay, so you might hear me say representation. The literature, because it's academic, has to use a nearly similar term to describe something completely different. And so ethnic incongruence in the literature is actually at a different level. So whereas ethnic congruence or representation is an individual within a context, ethnic incongruence is talked about as a transition between context and context. Okay, and so incongruence here is a noted decrease or a great decrease in numerical representation of individuals from context to context. And so we can think about this as someone's decline in representation. And we also will cover school belonging. And so we want to think about, we want to picture students' ties to their academic institutions. And so I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that we all transition from context to different contexts on our daily lives, and that often provides an opportunity for us to assess and reassess our social location within a new context, hopefully. So however, for the concern is for students who may experience ethnic incongruence, this is perhaps less an opportunity and may pose more of a challenge. And so students who face decline in representation or great decline in representation come to schools that are racially very different from where they come from in their neighborhood. They then must perceive how they are perceived in those schools and those environments. We can note that it is likely that the teachers and the important adult actors in those schools also do not represent students. And certainly the peer relationships have to be sort of reconsidered and reconstituted in schools where students are isolated. And when we think about, so literature has looked at, across actually disciplines, literature has looked at neighborhood ethnic density as a way to understand well-being and outcomes across health, academic achievement, ethnic identity formation. And for ethnic minority youth in particular, the degree to which their neighborhood ethnically represents them has been shown to be associated with greater ethnic racial identity exploration. Okay, so hold that in mind. But it's been posited by French and colleagues that an incongruent experience may pose an event that raises consciousness amongst ethnic minority youth. So when you enter a new context and are more isolated, you may be more aware of your social position and likely an inferior social position. But when they empirically test this, they find that it is actually true for white students, that white students who experience ethnic representation decline, they're the ones who report greater exploration in their ethnic identity. So it remains unclear. There's still plenty of research to do. The transition from context to context has more so been explored from a middle school to high school transition, okay? And so Benner and Graham have a few studies that have looked at the LA public school district and found that in that school district, Asian and Asian American students and white students very rarely have or experience ethnic incongruence from their middle schools to their high schools. But for Hispanic Latino students and African American students in that district, they certainly do. And so then looking within those two groups who do have more prominent experiences or proportions of their populations who experience ethnic incongruence, they've found that the students who experience incongruence have declines or report declines in school belonging across that transition. For African American students, there's a decline in GPA for those who are incongruent compared to their same race but congruent peers. And for Latino students, there are increased absences for incongruent Latino students compared to their congruent peers. And so as Nancy just said, we're pretty interested in neighborhoods. And so we wanted to examine not an event, or not yet examine the more singular event such as a transition from one school to another or middle school to high school. We're curious about what is the daily experience or weekly experience of BPS students in terms of their representations at home and at school. So something that is more woven into the fabric of students' lives. And so we are pursuing a few research aims, one of which is to understand in the BPS student body the extent to which students are ethnically represented in their neighborhoods. We want to see the change in students' representation from neighborhood to their schools. And then we want to see if any of these things predict their sense of school belonging. I can answer these questions later, but we used school data from 3 years of BPS data, BPS Demographics. And the findings that I want to highlight are, as a student body, BPS students are ethnically similar to about 25% of their neighbors and their schools. But there are distinct differences between the prominent racial ethnic groups within the schools. So as you see here, Asian and Asian American students represent that student body statistic. But for Black students, you see a decrease when they go into schools. For Hispanic Latinos, you see an increase in representation when they enter school. And for white students, you see a very grand decrease when they enter schools. So students' incongruence between their neighborhoods and schools differs greatly across these groups as well, and we could maybe previewed that in the previous slide. However, when we test these pairs against one another in terms of school belonging, it doesn't actually predict any differences or variation in school belonging across the full sample or within the respective racial groups. Of note, and this might be a preview for the next slide, the Asian Americans, although they typified and maintained ethnic representation between home and school, you see that they actually have a fair amount of students who experience incongruence within that racial group. And so finally, schools undergird the sense of school belonging. So we can't ignore the role of school and school climate and students' sense of belonging in the report of that. But what we find is that there's more nuanced patterns to examine. So first of all, I want to report that students across BPS report high school belonging, so congratulations. And so this is an example of that there's actually very little variation across groups. There's no disparity here. Black students are slightly lower than everyone else, but within each group, there's much, much wider variation, okay? And so the disparity doesn't happen across racial groups. Disparity happens within groups. And it's important to note, so this is preliminary, but schools account for about 9% of students report on school belonging. So it is the potential role of school in the context of school where we can provide intervention and think about how to bolster students' feeling and sense of belonging. But also, there's nuance in terms of how ethnic representation in the school informs students' sense of belonging. And so we see very similar patterns overall for students who have greater, as students experience greater representation in school, their sense of school belonging increases. However, for Asian American students, this relation is in the reverse, okay? And so we might focus on students here to understand where are these students going to school, first of all, and in what environments are they over a 40% threshold represented in their schools, and look at the climates that go on there. These are all preliminary analyses, but I'm happy to talk in greater depth with anyone about them, and thank you for your attention.
All right, well, I had a couple of questions, but I know we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm probably standing in between you and lunch, so I don't want to do that and get eaten up, so to say, by you guys. So I think I'd like to open the floor to questions and, questions and answers. What I would ask you to do, if you have a question, would be to stand up, project, and tell us who you are, and if an organization fits, label yourself through your organization. So with that, we got about 10 minutes for Q&A. Are there any questions? One and then two.
Hi, my name is Jasmine. I work at an after-school nonprofit. Should I still stand up? Or? Great, wonderful.
Yes.
So my question is for you, Stephanie. In terms of extended learning time, that's really interesting in terms of the work that we do, because part of an after-school program is obviously to extend some aspect of learning time. So I wanted to know what the conversation looked like in terms of comparing in-school, after-school, or in-school extended learning time versus after-school programming, and how those effects look similar or very different.
Thank you very much for that question. That would really expand the scope of what we were doing. I think at this point, looking at equity work, we wanted to look more at expanding the day because it affects all students. But I have heard your question numerous times, and I think before and after school resources are something that we would really love to look at, as well as summer and vacation academies and the impact that that has on opportunity and achievement gaps as well. So it's definitely something that we're thinking about. So thanks for asking that.
Gentleman to my left.
Hi, my name is Matt Welch. I'm with AIR, and my question's for Joseph, and it has to do with students who are attending two-year colleges and completion rates there. I know that within the world of those of us who study college attendance and career readiness and college completion, there's a debate about that two-year group and whether or not that group is seeking to graduate or whether or not they're seeking to take a course or two, complete a credential, do what it takes to get a job. And I'm wondering if your analysis looks at that as completion rates versus credential completion, or or some other metric we can use to determine what success looks like for that group of students who may not be looking for a four-year degree?
Sure. So in this study, we didn't have data specific on the students in terms of what share wanted to pursue a degree, but we have looked at it for our previous BPS classes, and it's very high. So the majority of students that are enrolling intend to pursue a degree. In fact, through some findings that APT looked at for the evaluation of coaching, we found that a lot of the two-year students really are seeking a four-year degree. So the college aspirations are quite high. It's just that they're facing challenges, kind of along the way as they pursue that path.
Questions? In the back.
Hi, my question's for Nancy. My name is also Nancy McArdle from the Diversity Data Kids Project at Brandeis. And I appreciated what you were talking about in terms of using the Opportunity Index to perhaps direct funds or other kind of resources to schools that have more kids that are facing challenges. So my question is, do you have a sense, or can you give us a sense of the distribution of schools currently in terms of the extent to which they have children with these types of disadvantages in terms of the communities they come from or the other types of disadvantages? In other words, to what extent are Boston Public Schools equal or unequal in terms of these important factors?
The index itself, so we look at the data that we gain from all the different sources that I described, and then from the algorithm, it's really the creation of an algorithm. From that algorithm, each school gets a score. And so then you can look at the range of scores within the districts. And so Boston Public Schools has a wide variety of neighborhoods in terms of the resources and challenges that they have. And so then they get a score, and then that score is used to think about what the level of concentrated advantage and disadvantage in any school, and then direct funding in those ways. And so I can't remember, maybe Colin, you know what the range of scores actually were in the Boston Public Schools. Do you remember?
Yeah, I mean, there's a wide range. We went from 0 to 1, and there are ones down around 0.1. And then there's ones all the way up to 0.9. I think the impetus for the Opportunity Index from the district side was the fact that we could take into account things like ELL status. We could take into account special needs. We could weight those things. But the only real measure of need outside of school was really, are you economically disadvantaged or not? And when you look at that measure, it makes our schools look a lot more even than they really are in reality. And so with this index, we can get very much more nuanced into the things I think Nancy talked about students are bringing to school. And we know anecdotally and now kind of through the index that there's vast differences between some of our schools, especially some of our open enrollment schools versus some of our more selective application schools versus our exam schools for the outside of the school factors that students are bringing into the school.
Hi, good morning. My name is Susan Paul, and I'm actually a Boston Public School alumna. And I went to college at Bridgewater State University, and I studied social work. I've worked in healthcare administration as well as county government in San Diego. I just wanted to affirm the work that you're doing because it's really important, because some of the questions when I went to school, I didn't have labels for it at the time, but I went to a lot of different schools. I went to the Quincy Dickerman. I went to advanced work class. I got switched to the Paul A. Dever, and then to the John W. McCormick. Then I tested into Latin Academy, but then I transferred to New Mission High. So I think that it's very important with the neighborhood and the context. All of my siblings graduated from elementary school at the Quincy Dickerman, which is no longer open, but I know that I had a different sense of identity and community by being bused to a different school. But I know that mentoring matters, as well as I want to speak to Boston PIC. I always had a PIC counselor when I was in high school and in college, so I had money to be able to graduate from college within 4 years. So I just kind of want to affirm the work that you're doing and the research that you're doing, because it's important, and I actually pay attention to it because it helps me to mentor, especially first-generation college students and people who are interested in the public sector to develop their careers. And it's been very effective looking at the bottom line and other success programs when I've done my work in San Diego, and now I'm ready to do it again in Boston. So thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Fabian Torres Ardila. I'm the Associate Director for the Mauricio Gaston Institute at UMass Boston. And I have a question for you, Professor Hill and Dr. Rose, in relation to the Opportunity Index. You know, I'm a mathematician for training, so I love the idea of having a number to reduce complex problems to a number. That's great. However, definitely you know what's going to happen with the Opportunity Index. People are going to begin to get Opportunity Index to school, make decisions about policy, about funding, and then reducing these complex problems to that number. So my question for you is, how do you think about addressing the fact that this number might become like a new MCAS score for schools, but not solving the problems of the students in the schools? So what would be your take on that?
Yeah, I think, oh, you can go first, but then
I was
Yeah,
going to
if
say part of the challenge, and you know, we really pushed back because around how this might be used as in our own group, not pushed back within our group, but pushing back and making sure we're prepared for how the public will hear this and interpret this. This is not a number that would ever get assigned to a kid. And it's not a public number that's a score for a school quality, because there's a whole separate issue about school quality and differences there. But what this number does is that in its simplicity, and its mathematical simplicity, which I share with you, the beauty of that is that it allows for, at a high level, to look at how schools vary and then direct funding and resources in that way. But at the school building level, they don't just get a score. They get to see how their school fared on all of those indicators, so that they know, for example, that a high portion of their students, if they have a low opportunity index, what proportion of their students are really coming from neighborhoods that are disadvantaged because of crime or safety or things. So they get to see at the particulars at the building level and be able to direct those funds. It's not telling them what programs they should have, but giving them additional funding or different kinds of funding that they can then direct in appropriate ways.
Yeah, and at the district level, I think being able to control, especially when you're talking about like actual resources, the different ways in which an OI would be implemented is important, right? And so there's a group formed that is looking over like the major allocations of it. This year, the only 2 buckets of funds that were used to push through it were our partnership dollars that were previously centralized, not given to schools to control, and really not equitably distributed. And then there was another pot of money that was just discretionary funds that we wanted to give the schools so that they could do more things outside of the core curriculum. And we made sure those 2 applications had two different cut scores and slopes in the way that we treated them. So there could be an issue around if every time we implemented the OI, we made a cut score where I'm on the other side of it, I'm not getting funded for something, and that continually happens. And so that can cause inequity too. But I think we have our eye on that kind of ball. So it is important as an institution to think about what you raised.
Hi, my name is Mohammad Katz, and I also had a question about the Opportunity Index. What are the plans for revisiting that in subsequent years, since student populations do change over time, especially if the BPS changes particular programs that are placed at particular schools?
Yeah, it'll be reiterated every year, at least in resetting the students, because it is a real-time kind of measure. So you have to be able to get a score of a school, you need to know the exact students that are in it. So partly through the year is when we, a little bit before budget time, but partly through the year when we have a kind of stable enrollment is where that index will be updated. We will also be looking at, I always say this is a living, breathing index. So I think we want to make sure that if there are ways that we can incorporate even more nuance in it, that we do that. So there'll be a process every year for us to reiterate.
And the thing I would add to that is partly in the design of the Opportunity Index, there are many factors that one could say we should include in understanding and identifying neighborhoods and neighborhood characteristics. But one of the key decisions we made in designing the index was that these had to be factors that we could get real live data on an annual basis. Like some things you would want to include, you're like, oh, that would be great to include, but you can only get it every 4 years or every 6 years or every 10 years. And those measurements were not appropriate for this kind of dynamic, flexible measure that is going to be calculated on an annual basis. So that was part of the design, to make sure that we had data that would get updated and refreshed on an annual basis.
At the neighborhood level, the weights are aggregated across 3 years for stability purposes. And so as new years of data come for the neighborhood portion, we can test whether we need to increase the number of years informing that aggregate or proceed every 3 years, or whatever the pattern might be going forward.
Hi, my name is Megan Doran. I'm a BPS parent and also a sociologist by training, so I'm excited to see this kind of use, this like theory, data, policy metric. And I just wanted to ask you to follow up a little bit. I know that the partnership dollars really were reallocated this year based on the Opportunity Index, and in a system where every schools feel a little bit pitted against each other, and no school feels like they have enough money regardless, and like most schools are struggling in some way, even if, definitely we need more equity in the ways that those funds are distributed. But I just wanted to ask you to reflect on how did that go this year with our lessons learned? Are you thinking about the way the Opportunity Index, you started to talk about that, but I was hoping you could talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, I think we learn lessons almost weekly around rolling something like this out, just in general around equity, and when you actually try to implement equity in a system that has a closed pot of money, that means there's going to be some redistribution, right? And there's going to be pain felt. I think having that second set of kind of discretionary funds to lower the hit of schools that were getting funded before and aren't getting funded now was helpful. We also had the partnership office that were great to wrap around the schools who might be losing some funds, to think creatively around how they could still salvage some of their partnerships. But no doubt there's pain. But I think looking at the landscape of what was going on, I don't think in good conscience we could continue to do what we were doing, which was a system of those that were savvy, that were privileged, got those resources because there were no guardrails. And so I think what it does is actually push our dialogue around, do we have enough in that pot to begin with? And in a way that I don't think you get at if those that have the power and the privilege can just get their hands on it. Oh, I'm getting the wrap-up sign. So I'd like to thank all of you for being a beautiful audience, and I'd love you to give a hand to our panelists who work so hard on these projects. And with that, have a nice lunch.